I never had heard the song before, but if you think about it, today would be a good question to ask when you look at the series we're talking about. What is the people's relationship in the story to Jesus? It'd be an interesting question. We started a series, you recall, on David. Last week, we were basically, what is God looking for, if you remember last week. First of all, we saw last week in the fact that we need to be waiting on God and not walking ahead. And first of all, you remember, God, according to Deuteronomy, was going to give them a king, but they jumped ahead and wanted to be like everybody else and wouldn't listen to God, and then they selected Saul. And they selected Saul because he was head and shoulders above everybody else in height, and he was good looking and looked like the type of leader they wanted. And obviously, it wasn't what they needed, and he was not a good leader. And how many times do you and I jump ahead? Any of you ever jumped ahead of God? Just one or two? It'd be better to say, has anybody not jumped ahead? But I think it's important to recognize. The second thing we've looked at is what God is looking for. If you remember, we saw it in Acts 13:22 when it says that David was a man after God's own heart, and then the text actually defines what that means. And it says that he was obedient to all his will. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize if we want to be a person after God's own heart, we have to do what he says. So what happens is, what are the things he's told us to do, and how well are we doing? The next thing we looked at, remember we talked about he was being desired. In 2 Chronicles, you remember we saw that God is looking to and fro over all the world for somebody whose heart is completely his. It's amazing, you look at throughout the Old Testament, every king comes up and said, we compared to David, he either didn't follow God at all, or he followed like his father David, but not completely. It's amazing, all the way through. We also saw David was described in Psalms under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and it said he shepherded Israel with the integrity of his heart. Great description. Can you imagine at the end of our life? Wouldn't that be great if it came up when we stood before God and it said, you did this, whatever your task is, with integrity. You taught with integrity. You served with integrity, whatever it might be. And then we also looked into how do you develop it. In Psalm 78, 70, and 71, David developed his skills when he was out with his sheep. When you think about that, would be in time of solitude. It would be in time of obscurity. Think about it, monotony. How would you like to take care of sheep day after day after day? Nobody around. But it's also in reality. You're going up against all the things you have to go up against. The bear, the lion, and everything else. So you have to serve faithfully. So we saw that last week. Today I'd like to continue and think a little bit about it. And that is seeing as God sees. How many of us see as God sees? And how many of us have a little trouble with our eyesight? The older I've got, talked with Richard earlier, after cataract surgery, I don't see as well as I did beforehand. You get in dark places and everything else, you just don't see well. Obviously, medicine's done well, but they cannot duplicate the human eye as well as what God has. Well, let's think about it. All three of our kids, when they're starting to date, I always desired them to date godly individuals and who they wanted. But I also, when they're looking at different ones, I also failed at times, and they've all done a better job of who they selected. And I'm very happy with who they did select. Because there are times I love, maybe you ought to date so-and-so. They're Christian, they're pretty good, and after I got to know the individual a little better, no, it's not a good match. They did a better job. But how many of us have done the same thing, even with a lot of other areas of our life? So I want to think about that, seeing as God sees. So let's look at it. Notice in 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16. You notice it's interesting when God has rejected Saul, and Samuel is now sent to Jesse's house to anoint a king. And he invites him, he tells him Jesse and to consecrate he and his sons. And you'll notice we'll pick it up on verse 6 of chapter 16. And it came about when they entered that he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord has anointed is before me. So notice the oldest comes forward and Samuel thinks what? This is it. We're going to see in just a minute why he's not it. But how many of us are getting caught up? Samuel was a godly man too. But he messed up. And notice then the answer in verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. I think it's important because it's so easy for all of us to look at the outward appearances. God looks at the heart. So let's think about that. Let's look at Saul then. If you remember, when you think about in chapter 17 of this, God looks at that. Look at what Saul does. When he goes before the Philistines, and we see it in chapter 17, there's armies and there's a valley in between. For the sake of time, I'll give that to you. But you have one side, you had the Israeli army, and on the other side, you had the Philistine army. And there's a valley between them. And you notice then you have them, and you have David's 3 older brothers were part of Saul's army. So Eli was with them. So let's think about what you have. The champion then in verse 4 of chapter 17. Remember, seeing as God sees. Notice how Saul sees. The champion comes forward. His name is Goliath from Gath in verse 9. It says he's 6 cubits in a span, which means what? How tall is he? Over 9 feet, up to 9 feet 9. Kind of a tall dude. You know, I've been on a basketball court with a person that was 7'6", and I couldn't, looking around and trying to do anything. I mean, it was impossible. And this guy's 2 feet tall. Notice then it says he had bronze helmet on his head. His clothing was scaled armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and bronze javelins slung between his shoulders. Okay, so how much did his armor? So he had everything covered in armor, and the armor weighed anywhere from 125 to 200 pounds that he's carrying. Okay, and then notice then his spear, which, by the way, how in the world do we know how much his spear weighed? The answer is coming if you think about it. But notice it says the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. The head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield carrier was walking before him. That means his shaft was 17 and 16, 33 pounds. How many of you like to pick up a spear that weighed 33 pounds? One hand, and you can throw it? You're talking about an incredibly massive individual. Now, he is the giant of their nation. Who is the giant of Israel's nation? Saul. Who should be fighting him? Saul. Who also was head and shoulders and good looking? David's older brother. So think about it when you have this. So notice then, it's also interesting in verse 8, he challenges them every day and he says, come down to me. So notice then Goliath would come down to the brook down the middle. They had the upper, they're up on the upper above, and he says, come down and fight me. And he does this, and notice in verse 16, he does it for how many days? Every morning and every evening for 40 days. So for 40 days, he's made a challenge, and what the challenge was is, hey, there's no need for all these people to die on either side. Let's just have a fight. Whichever champion wins, the other one serves. So, you send one down, and if he beats me, then we'll serve you, and if I beat you, then you serve us. And that was often done in those days. You've also seen some of the other movies that had similar things that have taken place. So you think about it. Here's the challenge. But does Saul do it? In fact, if you look at it, notice in 24, when all the men of Israel saw the man, they what? They fled. So every morning and evening, they'd come up in the morning to go fight, and he'd come out and make the challenge, and what do? They turn around and run. How many of us have giants in our life that we're facing? There isn't a person that doesn't have a giant they're facing or have faced. But think about it. So here you have him every day. Saul should be, and notice Saul sees his physical presence is so much greater than me, I can't do it. You notice then, remember the older brother, remember he was rejected. So notice then David is told then to bring food. His dad tells him to bring the food, and so he brings him, and notice he arrives in verse 22. David left his baggage in care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion of the Philistines from Gath named Goliath was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these words, and David heard it. So notice for 40 days he's been doing it, but David knows nothing about it and hadn't heard about it. He's talking, and notice then he hears them, and how the people fled, and the men of Israel. Have you not seen this man who's coming up? Notice he's coming up now. So that means what? If they're on one side and the other's on the other side, he's come down to the middle, and now it says he's coming up. So does that mean he's starting to come up the Israel side? How much fear is going to happen to you now if he's starting to come up? Which, if you think about it, if you have archers, you have the upper hand, but notice it's supposed to be one-on-one. They're all scared. Notice David is a little bit different. But notice then, we'll look at David here in just a minute. Notice in verse 25, he's coming up to defy Israel, and it'll be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel, meaning he doesn't have to pay taxes. Nor will his sons have to serve in the military and forced labor. So that'd be nice. How would you like to not have to pay taxes the rest of your life? It'd be kind of nice, wouldn't it? How many of us would retire? Okay, so notice, and that's the promise. Saul should have gone fighting. Instead of Saul fighting, he's saying what? I'm going to let somebody else do my fighting for me. Well, notice then, David's older brothers there, right? All three of them, three oldest. Which, by the way, his four others that were older than him were never mentioned in Scripture. He had 7 older brothers, but only 3, the 3 oldest are mentioned, who came to battle. Notice then what happens. Then in 28, now Eliab, his older brother, heard when he, talking about David, spoke to the man. Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, notice what he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Being pretty sarcastic, isn't he? Who are you to come down here? And why'd you leave those few scrawny things over there? And you're just insolent, and you're just wanting to see people get killed and go to battle, and you really have no concern. Notice his true colors come forward. Why isn't his older brother, who's bigger and taller and stronger than he, why isn't he fighting Goliath? Was God correct in not choosing Eliab? Did Samuel want to choose him? Samuel wanted to. He looked at outward appearance. How many times do you and I choose things on outward appearance that we shouldn't do? How many of you ever bought? It's amazing. I always find it humorous when people look at vehicles. They always look at the outer appearance. What does it look like? It looks good, therefore I want it. Well, I'm not concerned about the outer appearance. I care about how does it run. Will it get me from point A to point B and for how long? It's amazing. So you look at it. How did Saul look at him? He looked through man's eyes. He saw the giant. How did Eliab look at him? He saw the giant's eyes. But what about David? David, if you remember, we have to in chapter 16, you remember he was indwelt by the Holy Spirit. And then notice how he sees him in verse 26 and 36. In 26, notice David says, at the end of it, for this is an uncircumcised Philistine, and he should taunt the armies of the living God. Remember, he's just a teenager, and he recognizes, hey, because Goliath is saying, if you read earlier, that his guys are going to deliver people to him. And so he's not made it a spiritual battle. Our gods are better than your gods, and our gods are going to win. David recognizes, hey, no. Notice David sees the truth, and he sees Goliath for who he is. And you and I, how much have Goliaths in our lives, but we only see the outward. We don't see it in God's eyes. He does the same thing in 36. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. Notice he doesn't see the battle between me and Goliath. He sees the battle between God and his gods. And that's where we need to get. And that's why I said you see as God sees. How many of us are looking at things only in our own eyes? And I think so many of us are failing because we're looking at it through our own eyes. That's where God wants us. God wants us to have a Goliath in our life, so we can't do it on our own. I'll guarantee you, if that was a 5'5" guy out there, what would have happened? We wouldn't have had the story. There'd been somebody out there fighting, right? So think about it. When you or seeing as God sees, is it an obstacle or is it an opportunity? You think about it in Judges chapter 6, it's amazing when you look at it, and they come to Gideon, and God, through the angel, says what? The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Now, where was Gideon when that was said to him? He's hiding in a wine press. Well, it looks like a valiant warrior to me, doesn't it to you? But that's what God sees what you can be. What about Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5? You remember when he said, if this is of God, what? Don't go against it, or else you're going to be going against God. And how many times Saul's going to do this? He's going to go against David continually, and he's going against God. That's not a place to be. How many of us are going with God, and how many of us are going against God? So think about it. First of all, serving God, or seeing as God sees. The second thing I want to look at is serving where you're at. In chapter 16, you remember when they come to Samuel comes to Jesse and their 7 brothers, and he said, none of these are right. And he says, do you have a younger one? And remember, they go get David. Where was David at in verse 11 in chapter 16? He's tending the sheep. I think we need to recognize we need to serve God where we're at. He's tending the sheep. If you notice in chapter 16, if you go back, if you remember when the Spirit leaves Saul in verse 14, and you remember, leave Saul, and then they say you need to get some music to play. And so notice it's interesting in verse 18 of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel 16, 18. Then one of the young men answered and said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is a skilled musician, a mighty man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech, a handsome man, and Lord's with him. How old is he? He's a teenager. I mean, that is an amazing statement about him. He's serving God where he's at. He's taking care of the sheep, which is going to help him later. He's going to shepherd Israel. But does he know anything about the palace? So now he's going to be the musician. He's going to take care of Saul. But he's going to find out more about the palace and how things work. And so, or how to run the government, basically, through watching. So now he comes. It's interesting, he would play, but he goes back and forth. He didn't stay with Saul. The reason we know he doesn't stay is what's going to happen here a little bit later. Notice in chapter, when he's playing the harp, and notice in verse 19, so Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is what? Now think about that. Did he just get appointed king? King in wait? But he's not king yet. God hadn't made him king, so what does David do? He goes back and does what he's been doing, taking care of the sheep. Now they go and get him out to be the musician. Well, notice what happens in chapter 17. He's taken, Saul is off fighting Goliath, right? Supposed to be. And notice in 17 and so on, Jesse tells him to go take food to his brothers. So notice in verse 20. So David arose early in the morning and did what? Left the flock. So he goes and he helps out with Saul, and Saul's gone fighting, and he's back taking care of the sheep again. How many of us, basically, we have a job to do, but how well are we doing? You know, just because you may have graduated from college, you may have done different things, you still have something to do. If God wants to trust us with something more, how well are we doing with what he's given us now? And so he goes back and he takes care of them. So I'm thinking about it. How and where is God having to serve today? You know? Am I serving faithfully now? The reason I say that, in Luke chapter 16, what does it tell us in Luke 16? In verse 10, I'll just read it for you for the sake of time since we have the Lord's Supper today. In Luke 16, notice what it says in verse 9 and verse 10. And I say to you, make friends for yourself by means of mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, you may receive into eternal dwelling. And notice in verse 10. He who is faithful in very little thing is faithful also in much. He who is unrighteous in a little thing is unrighteous in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous mammon, who will entrust you with true riches? If I'm not faithful in doing a little job, then why should God give me something else? In fact, I've often said and seen it. If you want a job done, do you give it to the busiest person you know or somebody who has time? Give it to the busiest person. They always seem to do one more thing. You give it to somebody who has a lot of time and they go, I'm sorry I didn't get it done, maybe next week. It's just amazing. But think about it. Am I serving where God has me? Every one of us has something that we can be doing. What did Dorcas do? She just sewed clothes, right? But how much of an impact did she have on her community? We all have something to do. Notice the third thing then, besides seeing as God sees and serving where God has us, notice the stepping stones in David's life. You remember he started off taking care of sheep, and how well did that help him when he then later got to the palace? You also notice when he went, we saw the one, if you remember in verse 36 of 17, you remember when Saul asked him, you're just nothing but a youth. And he tells him, you notice, your servant has killed both lion and bear. Okay, so how did he know he could fight Goliath? Because I've already fought a lion and a bear. You know, how much are using our everyday experiences in our life, knowing there's others to come, there's other giants. You think the first time you met that lion, you think you might have been a little scared? You think if you met a bear, you know, when I'm on vacation and I see a bear, I don't get out and go up very close to him. You know, I use my camera or I let my wife go out and get a picture. She knows the story there. She thought I was getting a little too close to the bear. But it's amazing how many times that we all do things like that. But notice then, one giant can lead to another with their stepping stones. And notice he was able to fight him because God was with him. Notice the second thing, besides being the sheep to the shepherd of the sheep and then to Israel, and lions and bears. Notice in chapter 16, if you notice, I don't know if you caught it, when he was employed by Saul, and that helped him as a stepping stone in the court. And then when you get into chapter 18, when he fought Goliath, notice in verse 5 of chapter 18 what he now does. Saul likes him, and Saul in verse 5, and said that David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of what? War. So now he's in charge of the army. But he's not king yet. But is he getting stepping stones and is he getting experience? Each time he's getting more and more experience as a young man. When he does become king, he will know how to do things. How many of us are taking it as stepping stones as God's bringing things into our life to prepare us? And how many of us are willing to do it? Now what's going to happen, Saul's going to demote him here shortly. But he does it and God can use it. So how many of us are using the stepping stones? Am I serving with integrity where God has placed me? Am I willing to go to the next step? How many people are willing to take the next step? How many people know I want to do the next step? You know, God may not have, you think about it, when did God enable Saul to become king? When he was anointed, correct? When did God, the Spirit, indwelt David? After he was anointed. How many of us are looking at a task and thinking, I can't do it? Well, maybe you couldn't do it in your past, but if God's asking you today to do it, will He enable you to do it today? I think what happens, we look at our past and say, I couldn't do it, or I can't do it. Well, that might be true in the past. But if God has brought you to that place today, you can do it today if that's what He's letting you. Will He ever bring you where He won't enable you? I think it's important to think about it. The last one I want to think about is, are we serving with God's anointed, or are we going against it? In chapter 18, you think about it, just after David defeats Goliath, look at Jonathan's response. It's amazing. From 1 to 4, it says Jonathan was knitted to him, and he loved David as himself in verse 1. And notice then what also happens, Jonathan strips himself of the robe, and he gave David with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. What did Jonathan just do?
His position.
He gave up his position, and he recognizes, David, you are God's anointed, you'll be the next king. And notice then, Jonathan is saying, I won't be the next king, you will be. That's amazing. How much are you going to say? Because where's the prestige and power coming from? I mean, it'd be a whole lot easier to see and fight. Saul's going to fight him all the way through. Jonathan recognizes how many of us are fighting what God is trying to do, and how many of us are working with God. Jonathan recognizes it, and he works with it, and Saul does just that. Look at some of the things that happens. If you remember in verse 5 down to 9, when David comes in, and remember they're talking about they have Saul has killed thousands, and David is what? Killed 10,000, and notice it makes him mad. And on verse 9, Saul looks on suspicion. Because he knows he's been replaced. You'll notice then an evil spirit comes on him, and then notice everything that David does prospers. He demotes him in 13, and then notice in 14, 15, Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, and he dreaded him. He's opposing him all the way through. You ever wonder what kind of transition it would have been if Saul had said, I blew it, you're the anointed, let's make it a good transition, let's work together. It would be amazing what would happen. How many of us are willing, we recognize that things are up and other people need to replace us, are willing to work with people? And how many of us are fighting it all the way, this is my position, this is my stuff, I won't give it up, I'm going to fight, and it makes it very, very hard. And I think if you find it all the way through, and you think about it, demoted, and then 18, you remember the marriage that you have, and remember when you fought in the battle, you remember whoever killed Goliath was crowned with the wealth and the daughter. Well, and notice in verse 19, he gives the daughter to somebody else. He just killed Goliath. He's supposed to get the daughter, but Saul doesn't, and the reason for it. Now, he then is going to say, oh, but I'll give my other daughter to you, but you got to go fight. You got to not only fight the Philistines, you got to kill 200 of them. And his thinking was, you aren't going to kill 200 of them. One of them is going to kill you, and then I don't have to worry about you because I got rid of it. Was he working with David, or is he working against David? He sees God's with David, and he's going against God, and he thinks he's going to win. And it's amazing how many times we do a lot of the same stuff. So you think about it. Am I willing to play second fiddle? Jonathan was. But how many of us are like Saul? We're fighting it all the way. So let's think about some applications, then we'll have the Lord's Supper. Do I see God? Do I see a God as David sees him when I go up against my Goliaths? Or do I see my Goliaths, my giants, like Saul did and like Eliab did and others? By the way, when you're facing giants, it's intimidating, is it not? It's also lonely. When David went to fight Goliath, who was with him? Where was his brother at? By the way, the shield that the armor bearer had, that's the Hebrew word for the large shield, meaning the full body shield. How many shields did David have? How much armor did David have? And did you also notice it said David ran towards the Goliath? He ran towards the fight. Most of us and all the rest are doing what? When he gave the challenge, they ran away from the fight. How is God, or how can God use me today? Am I being used, or how can I be used? I dare to bet most of us, if somebody came up to us and asked us to do something, we would immediately respond, how? Is this of God, or we respond with our own, like Saul or David? Just our human things. I'm too old, I can't do this, I can't do that. Okay? Humanly speaking, David never should have won. But think about it. Another one, am I serving where I am with integrity? If I'm not serving where I am, why should God ask me to do something else? Remember the giants of the past, because they'll help you when you face the giants of the future and today. What did David do with Goliath's head? He brought it to the palace and gave it to Saul, but what did he do with his weapons? He took it to his tent. how do you think we know how much it weighed and everything else? Do you think maybe he kept those as a reminder? How many of us remember the giants of our past, so when we face the giants of our future, they can help us get through it?